This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. What I'm looking at today is 1983's Something Wicked This Way Comes, directed by Jack Clayton. If you recall, a few years ago there was a brouhaha over Zack Snyder's Justice League. It was all revolving around a slightly altered version of a movie that we've already seen. I just didn't see the point of it. It made no sense to me. Though what I always was interested in was David Ayer's cut of The Suicide Squad. And that's because we've never seen that movie as he intended it to be seen. If you recall, the movie was essentially taken from him, re-edited. I don't know if there were added shots, though it was definitely re-edited, and new music was added. And it changed the entire feel and focus of his movie. In other words, it was no longer his movie. Sure, he shot it, but the way it was treated by the studio, Warner Brothers, changed it into an entirely different thing, apparently. And I add apparently because I haven't seen it. I have no idea. Though based upon comments made by David Ayer, it very much appears that the movie that was released in theaters was not the movie he intended to show people. And the thing of it is, the David Ayer cut is likely never to be seen by anyone other than a few select people. And I add the word likely in there because Warner Brothers is all about money. And if they think there's even a chance that showing David Ayer's version of Suicide Squad will earn them millions of dollars, they're likely to do it. Though at this point, the odds of it are small. And the point of me talking about the Suicide Squad is that, and this was unknown to me prior to my research, but Jack Clayton's Something Wicked This Way Comes received a similar treatment from Walt Disney Studios. Jack Clayton was the director of a movie called The Innocents, and that's the film I suspect had a lot to do with Disney hiring him to direct Something Wicked This Way Comes. And if you've seen The Innocents, it's very good. It's very haunting, though it's not something a traditional moviegoer might enjoy. In other words, it's kind of slow-paced. It's very unusual, though, in the way it's shot. But I don't know if it fits modern sensibilities, though I can see why he was chosen. That being said, when he shot his movie, Disney didn't like what they saw. They thought it was very uncommercial, and they thought that the music was too dark, whatever that meant. So how Disney responded is very similar to how Warner Brothers responded to David Ayer, which is to say, they locked him out of the edit, invested $4 million more to shoot additional sequences, add new music, and re-edit. Now, in the case of Suicide Squad, the likelihood is low that we will ever see David Ayer's cut. Though that's not the case with Something Wicked This Way Comes. Because apparently, Indiana University, Indianapolis has Jack Clayton's cut of the movie. What they list on their website is that they have, quote unquote, an early version of Something Wicked This Way Comes. Now keep in mind something. There are only two versions. The first version is Jack Clayton's original cut, which, as I said, Disney didn't approve of and re-edited, add new music, and so on and so forth. The second version is the theatrical version, which is a version you can probably find on some streaming service to purchase or watch or whatever. My point is simply that Jack Clayton's version is more likely than not only out there, but we can actually watch it. And I'm going to try to look into, in the future, some way of doing exactly that. Something Wicked This Way Comes revolves around two boys, Jim Nightshade and Will Holloway, and they're coming to their town of Mr. Dark's Pandemonium Carnival. Though what they could not possibly realize is that there's more to Mr. Dark and his carnival. Namely, he's there to capture souls. In some ways, he's like the devil himself. And the only person who becomes aware of Mr. Dark is Will Holloway's father, a man who's become lost in his own regrets and fears and doubts, and feels somewhat powerless to affect change around him. This is the man who has the sole responsibility of stopping the machinations of the evil Mr. Dark. The actors who play Jim Nightshade and Will Holloway are Sean Carson and Vidal Peterson. And they're not great actors. They're not terrible, but they're not that good either. And the problem with this is that the other actors around them are so strong. You have Jason Robards, you have Jonathan Bryce, you have Pam Grier. The caliber of actor in Something Wicked This Way Comes is so high that these two younger actors just aren't on the same level. They're relatively weak in their roles. And once again, this is not to say that they're bad, because they're not. But I think you place any young actor against actors of the caliber that I just mentioned, and they're not going to look particularly good. Another issue with Something Wicked This Way Comes is the visual effects. It's not that they're bad, a word I try to avoid unless something is truly bad, but they're oftentimes these 2D effects, as in cartoons. And it doesn't quite mesh well. As I said, it's not that it's bad, it just looks out of place and kind of odd. And sometimes the effects also look like what Ralph Bakshi is known for, which are rotoscoping. So the effects have this odd look to them. When I was growing up and first saw this movie, I thought it was interesting. Though, as I've rewatched the movie, they don't hold up nearly as well as they possibly could. Now keep in mind, this movie was made in 1983. There was CGI, and in fact, there were significantly more computer-generated imagery in this movie, but it was cut. So if something along those lines were done in reference to some of the visual effects, I think it would have better suited the movie. It's also worth mentioning that when the movie starts, there's a voiceover, as there is when it ends. This was not something that Jack Clayton did. This was Disney after the fact. Now the issue with the voiceover is that it's telling you things that you can imply from the visual. In other words, it's not entirely necessary, though I can understand why Disney went with the voiceovers. They do evoke a certain feeling, a certain sentimentality. But once again, I'm really curious as to what Jack Clayton intended for this movie, because they're not there at all. And I mentioned earlier that the music was changed because Disney thought it would be too dark. If you listen to Jack Horner's soundtrack for Something Wicked This Way Comes, it's very good music. Though once again, the music of Georges Delerue was excised from the final cut, which makes me wonder what this music sounded like, because, as I said, Disney thought it was too dark, though there's a certain darkness to Jack Horner's score as well. It just boggles my mind, some of the changes that were apparently made to this movie by Disney, and they make me even more want to see what Jack Clayton actually intended. Another issue with Something Wicked This Way Comes is that tonally, it's kind of off. And I assume this is due to the control of the movie being taken from its director. But it's hard to tell at points if it's intended for young adults or adults. It's very strange, and it doesn't quite mesh all that well. Something Wicked This Way Comes is, visually speaking, gorgeous to look at. It's very well shot, and while the color palette is fairly bland, we're talking mainly about earth tones, it's still beautiful to look at. And James Horner's score, while I'm still curious about what Georges Delerue did, is very fitting for what we see. It's haunting at points, it's creepy at points, and it's very triumphant at points. It's a well-done soundtrack. And as I mentioned earlier, the acting in this movie is remarkable. Other than the two young leads, everyone works really well. This movie is so well cast. Though I think it's worth mentioning two actors that had minimal lines, or none at all in some instances, but are really exemplary and show how the craft can be so masterfully done. One of those actors is Pam Grier, who played the Dust Witch. What's interesting was the way she moved. Now, keep in mind, Pam Grier does not talk at all in the entire movie. She appears quite a bit, but she never talks. But she has this presence that makes her appear somewhat eerie. Another character worth mentioning is Mr. Cougar, who's played by Bruce Fisher, and he is Mr. Dark's right-hand man. He has more lines than Pam Grier's Dust Witch, but then again, literally, who doesn't? But he has a certain presence about him. Just by him standing there exudes menace. And this is the type of acting I'm talking about when I refer to the two younger actors. They just don't have. He is just really excellent at the role without doing a lot. Just by him standing there, there's an implied threat. As I said, I have not seen Jack Clayton's cut, though, once again, I intend to, if at all possible. And this movie works surprisingly well, despite all the behind-the-scenes chaos that went on. And that's very unusual. Though I think it's the behind-the-scenes chaos that made this movie neither fish nor fowl, in that I don't think it's for young people. It's too intense, and there are two violent scenes, which by my reckoning makes it one of the most violent, if not the most violent, Disney film ever made. But it doesn't feel like it's for adults either, because it's focused around two young boys and their antics. So it's kind of hard to figure out what caused this schism. Though, as I said, I do think it's because the project was taken from Jack Clayton. And let's keep in mind that not every decision that the studio made in reference to this movie was bad. Jack Clayton wanted to hire either Peter O'Toole or Christopher Lee to play Mr. Dark. The studio went with Jonathan Bryce because mainly he was cheaper. And in hindsight, that's a great decision because Jonathan Bryce is wonderful in the role. But Disney also invested $4 million more into altering the movie. Now I know I'm speaking from hindsight here, but they might as well have hired Christopher Lee. I still don't know if Peter O'Toole would work in the role. That's why I advocate for Christopher Lee. They might as well have hired him because they were going to spend the money, and he would certainly be less than that. In any case, Something Wicked This Way Comes, even in the form that it is currently in, is really interesting and it's a lot of fun. Now, what do you think? This is Brian, screenfiles.com and review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow. Peace.